The U.S. Grains Council presents Colombia 2040, a detailed assessment of Colombia's feed grain demand over the next 20 years, visualizing the evolution of major trends and influences and the impact of COVID-19 over animal protein consumption and production. In this video, we will discuss the most relevant demand and supply drivers for yellow corn, the variables that impact them, and two possible corn demand scenarios leading up to the year 2040. Let's begin with the animal protein consumption in Colombia and demonstrate the impact of COVID-19. Between 2010 and 2019, all meats per capita consumption grew at an average rate of nearly 4%, going from 48 kilograms to more than 66 kilograms. One of the many impacts of COVID-19 included a large economic and job loss in the country, resulting in much lower incomes for many households. This forced many Colombians to change their eating habits and search for alternative sources of protein, generating a 7% drop in consumption, a 3-year setback. COVID also affected dairy consumption, but the impact was less severe than that of meat consumption. Assuming a 3.2% GDP growth and a 12% unemployment rate, the study estimates all meat per capita consumption is estimated to grow at an average annual rate of around 3% from 2020 to 2030, reaching 85 kilograms per person per year. From 2030 forward, the increase in consumption will be slower and mainly determined by the population growth, increasing at an average annual rate close to 2% to reach more than 90 kilos of consumption per capita by 2040. By 2026, eggs consumption will reach 365 units per year, with an average annual rate growth between 1.8 and 1.1%. By 2030, consumption should reach 391 units, and in 2040, it will be a little over 400. For dairy, the study estimates an average annual growth rate of almost 1% for the 2 decades, reaching 190 liters per person per year by 2040. Now let's look into animal protein production. Although imports help satisfy the Colombian needs of animal protein, domestic production is the principal supply source. The 2020 import market share for chicken meat was 5.5%, 12% for pork, less than 1% for beef, and 1% for dairy. Between 2010 and 2019, domestic animal protein production grew at an average annual rate of 4%. The effect of the pandemic was mixed. While pork and milk production grew, indicating a better share over domestic consumption, poultry and beef production fell. A fundamental driver of yellow corn demand in Colombia is its use as the main ingredient for feed production. Between 2010 and 2020, there was an average annual growth of around 5%, triggered by an increase in feed demand. In Colombia, the number one user of yellow corn are animals. To supply yellow corn demand for feed, Colombia may use domestic production and imported corn. However, local production has not been able to keep pace with the demand. On the contrary, the self-sufficiency gap of yellow corn continues to widen. In 2000, domestic corn production accounted for 40% of the total demand use, compared to 2020 when it was only 14%. Therefore, imported corn has grown at an average annual rate of over 5%. The United States has been the majority market shareholder since the ratification of the Free Trade Agreement in 2012. The study analyzed variables that may affect the supply and the demand, modifying the forecasts. Macroeconomic and social and political factors, trade policy, as well as variables related to consumer trends and behaviors, and changes in poultry and livestock production, such as the recent approach towards more efficient and industrialized systems. Also, policies that promote growth, support entrepreneurship, and the internationalization of the sector. These are all factors taken into account while conducting the analysis of future demand. In terms of production, Colombia's feeding practices have changed in the last decade, with the increased demand for livestock products. Improved feeds have played a relevant role, especially for the poultry and pork sectors. The poultry industry has almost moved entirely from traditional farming to using cutting-edge nutritional technologies and science. The pork industry is moving towards an intensive production system, following international feeding standards and technologies. Some pork farmers have been slow to adopt improved feeding technologies, so there is still room for additional growth in the sector. The beef and dairy industry has undergone the lower change. Nutrition is based mainly on free shepherding. Improved feeding technologies usage is limited to modern dairy production, where the industry uses feeding supplements to increase milk production. We will go over two probable forecast scenarios. In the most optimistic scenario, with annual GDP growth of 3.2% and an unemployment rate of 12%, the average yearly growth of the demand for yellow corn up to the year 2030 is 3.2%, with imports increasing 3.5%. While in the following decade, demand and imports growth will slow down to 0.8 and 0.7% respectively. In this scenario, in 2030, Colombia will need 9 million metric tons of yellow corn, and in 2040, 9.7 million. In a more conservative scenario, with annual GDP growth of 2.1% and an unemployment rate of 14%, the annual growth of yellow corn demand up to 2030 would be 2.9% and 3.1% for imports. And in the 2030-2040 period, demand and import growth slows down to 0.7 and 0.6% respectively. In this scenario, by 2030, Colombia will demand 8.7 million metric tons of yellow corn and 9.4 in 2040. With the study's estimates of higher animal protein consumption and limited domestic yellow corn supply over the next 2 decades, additional demand for imported corn continues to highlight the relevance of this market for U.S. corn producers. The United States will continue to be in a strong competitive position due to economies of scale, accessibility, and reliability, leveraged with a favorable free trade agreement. Through the U.S. Grains Council, U.S. corn producers have been an ideal partner in supporting Colombia's animal and feed industry production development. Our commitment through our strategic partnerships will continue to foster growth in Colombia for the next 2 decades and beyond. For more information on this study, contact the Latin American office of the U.S. Grains Council.